Hopefully some of the people might want to come back to the community.
After a century, the community of Shoal Lake 40 will finally have a year-round road.
I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Assembly of First Nations, Yukon region.
And a young woman has been voted in as the territory's regional chief. She joins 2 other women elected to the Assembly of First Nations. Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. There has been another resignation from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Métis lawyer Breen Willette resigned over the long weekend, becoming the 24th person to step away from the embattled inquiry. Willette says he might not be the only person to resign this week. In a letter of resignation, Willette accused the federal government of undermining the independence and impartiality of the inquiry. He feels the government is avoiding its responsibility.
What they're doing is, instead of saying, we don't want you to continue, they're saying, here's a short extension instead, do the best you can. When you ask an inquiry to do the best they can with limited resources, you're no longer allowing that inquiry to follow its mandate.
It's been over a year since construction started on an all-season road into a First Nation in Ontario. With an end date in sight, community members are looking forward to their newfound freedom. Ashley Branson brings us this update.
Phase 1, the Freedom Road project, started last year. Phase 2, this spring.
The second phase of the Freedom Road project is already progressed beyond our timeline.
Band Council member Roxanne Green sees light at the end of the tunnel.
We see our community growing and thriving, and we'll be able to start working on our economic development and working towards self-sufficiency in the community.
The people of Shoal Lake were forced onto a man-made island a century ago so Winnipeg could have drinking water, making the only way in or out by ferry or ice road.
We've been oppressed so long. We've been living in crisis mode every day for so many years now, just not being able to come and go when we please, come home safely, have access to everyday human rights like water for ones.
With the new road set to be complete soon, community member Gwen Red Sky says there might be a boost in population.
Hopefully some of the people might want to come back to the community, move back to the community, or be part of the community because they live off reserve, and a lot of times they don't want to cross the lake.
But with many benefits comes some concerns.
I do have an apprehension about drugs and alcohol, and of course human trafficking is a scary issue.
In that context, Chief and Council have considered a security checkpoint.
Just because we don't know who or what will be coming in and out of the community, and we want to ensure first and foremost our community safety.
After speaking with Council member Roxanne Green, she says Phase 2 of Freedom Road is set to be completed by December of this year. However, the official end date for the road is scheduled for June 2019. Ashley Branson, APTN National News, Shoal Lake 40.
A special herd of dairy cattle that have been safeguarded by local farmers will soon be going home. Federal government has approved the cows' return to the Joyceville prison farm in Kingston, Ontario. Here's Annette Francis with more.
You're under camera. You're supposed to behave.
Morning Joy's days at Jeff Peters' farm are numbered. This young cow could soon do time in the Joyceville institution.
It was exciting. It was very exciting to hear that the government has taken our advice and restored the prison farms. It was a long time coming, but there was a huge support group that they couldn't ignore.
In 2010, the prison farm programs were shut down by the Harper Conservatives, but prison farm supporters believe the work helped rehabilitate prisoners.
When you have inmates come and say it saved their life, they called it the miracle farm, how could you ignore those anecdotal stories? And we don't think agriculture was respected by the government.
When the farms closed, members of the Save the Prison Farms campaign bought some of the cattle and fostered them, hoping a change in government might also bring a change in attitudes. And it did. In the February budget, the Liberal government committed $4.3 million over 5 years to reopen the prison farms at the Joyceville and Collins Bay institutions. Just last week, it confirmed that operation will include cow and goat milk production. Peter says he's now negotiating with the federal government to send some of the herd back.
On my farm, there's maybe about 10 of the animals. We hope to have about 35 animals to go back to start the new herd, and it represents a nucleus of the old herd, which was a very well-bred herd at that time.
Prison farm advocate Diane Dowling says it's been a long haul, but it's great news. She says what sustained the campaign over the years was the ongoing support.
People kept coming out to our meetings. You know, we'd have our first public meeting, I think about 250 people came to. We'd hold a different kind of event and different people would be there. And so we kept saying, well, you know, we got to keep moving on this because the community is behind us.
According to Peters, there's a lot of repairs and infrastructure upgrades to be done, but the cows will finally come home by next spring.
There you go, girl.
Annette Francis, APTN National News, Ottawa.
Yukon chiefs have put their trust in Clooney Ademic, one of the youngest females to serve on the Assembly of First Nations Executive Committee. She was sworn in as the territory's regional chief last week. Shirley McLean reports.
I will bear true faith and allegiance to the Assembly of First Nations Yukon region.
An emotional day for 31-year-old Clooney Ademic, who took her oath in front of Yukon chiefs at their annual General Assembly held in the community of Mayo.
These are the moments I think that can be the most hard when you're amongst your own, so thank you for giving me a moment.
Like her first name, Clooney is a member of the Clooney First Nation and has been serving as the interim regional chief since January. She replaces the late Mike Smith. She has now been acclaimed into the position with the full support of Yukon First Nations.
And it's about showing up every single day, being kind, being respectful, working together, being humble. And so those are the things really that when we look to leadership is what it's all about.
With trying to
Ademic is not new to the AFN. She has sat on its youth council and has previously served as an advisor to national chiefs Sean Atleo and Perry Bellegarde.
Here we are in Yukon nominating a young woman to the Assembly of First Nations. No questions asked, she gets the job. Way to go, Yukon.
Ademic is not the first Yukon Indigenous woman to hold this position. She's the third in line behind Shirley Adamson and Mary Jane Jim. Jim received her own accolades at the General Assembly by being honored a lifelong dedication award for serving Yukon First Nations. She says Yukon is a matriarchal society and women have always had a place in leadership roles. Jim believes Ademic will do a great job in bringing gender equality to the AFN executive.
I think Clooney has the skill and the education and knowledge and the background in Yukon politics as well as Northern Policy Initiative information. So I think she has the qualifications to do this, and I'm excited for her and for us in the Yukon in the North. She's already proven herself, I think.
Ademic says she will get her marching orders from Yukon chiefs to bring their concerns, needs and wants to the national level, like housing, education and child welfare.
In this role, it's about reflecting the voices and reflecting their experiences and the needs of our communities at the national level. And it becomes about fairness and equity, and it becomes about framing what it is that we need as Yukon First Nations.
Adamek joins 2 other women who have been elected to the executive table at the Assembly of First Nations this year. Marlene Poitras, Regional Chief of Alberta, and Roseanne Archibald, the Regional Chief for Ontario. Shirley McLean, APTN National News, Mayo, Yukon.
Time for a quick break, and then we'll hear from Mi'kmaq lawyer Pam Palmer about the high rates of Indigenous youth in the prison system. Here's a look at Wednesday's weather forecast. Starting on the east coast, a scorcher in Fredericton, 32 under the sun, 29 in Halifax. Sunny skies and a high of 11 for Nain, 19 for Happy Valley, Goose Bay. Hot across much of Quebec, 30 in Quebec City, 33 in Montreal. The heat wave continues for southern Ontario, 34 in London and Ottawa, 33 in Windsor with showers, 33 in Timmins, 32 for Sudbury and Kapuskasing. Chilly and wet in northern Manitoba, 14 with rain in Flin Flon and the Pas. Rain and 23 in Barons River, 29 with showers in Gimli Harbour. In Saskatchewan, 19 in Swift Current, Yorkton, Saskatoon, and North Battleford. 18 in Buffalo Narrows on Wednesday, and in Meadow Lake, where rain is on the way. Welcome back. Indigenous youth continue to be overrepresented in the correctional system. A recently released report detailed just how grim some of those numbers are. Our Melissa Ridgen recently spoke about the overrepresentation with lawyer Pam Palmer.
Thank you for joining me to talk about this. So I guess it's not surprising that there's an overrepresentation of Indigenous youth in jails throughout this country. But what about this new report struck you?
It wasn't so much that it was new information, because we've actually been trying to raise the alarm on this rising incarceration rate for a really, really long time. So has the Office of the Correctional Investigator, so has the United Nations, but it doesn't really been picked up as the crisis that it is. So I think what's different about this report is that it really highlights some of the most glaring statistics, so that you know that overall youth corrections is going down, overall crime is going down, and overall that incarceration is going down, but not for Native people. In fact, it's skyrocketing across men, women, and children, and the fastest growing rate is for Indigenous girls. I mean, in one province, I think it was Saskatchewan, they're well over 90% of the intake is Indigenous girls, when we don't even make up 5% of the population nationally. Yeah. So that's a problem.
So is there, we're committing more crimes, or is it that we are more likely to be put in jail for the crimes we commit, or is it a combination, or is it something different?
Yeah, so here's the thing. The Office of the Correctional Investigator long ago addressed this kind of myth that we're just more criminal. Inherently, by nature of our culture, we're more criminal. We know that is not the case, that this is a direct result of colonization, and not far off colonization, but the ongoing colonization. So, you've got the legacy of residential schools and 60s scoop, but you also have the current legacy of, poverty, dispossession, racism, and violence in our society, kids in foster care. And these are the underlying causes. But along with that is also the racially discriminatory, purposeful, and chronic underfunding of federal programs and services that the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has said is the #1 reason why kids are in foster care. Yeah. Well, if you look at the makeup of the kids that are going into corrections, more than 2/3 of them came from the foster care system. So Canada has created a pipeline direct from foster care into prison, also into human trafficking, into murdered and missing Indigenous women, into suicide, into sexual abuse. I mean, you name it. And the prospects are bleak when Canada's in control.
Well, and then so we fix it how? You're pointing at a pipeline, but that pipeline has a lot of sub-pipes going into that massive pipe. Where do you even start fixing
Well,
this?
You have to cut off the flow. What's the #1 feeder group into youth corrections, for example? Foster care. We know foster care is a problem. What's the #1 feeder group to murdered and missing Indigenous girls? Foster care. So, okay, we've got a major problem. Let's deal with that. Let's stop taking kids away from their families. Let's keep them in their communities and their extended families. Let's recognize First Nation jurisdiction over their kids on and off reserve. But you know, so you've got to stem the tide there. You've got to deal with racism in policing. Why are these kids being arrested for stealing chocolate bars anyway, when that would never happen to, you know, other kids in Canada? So we need to deal with the over arrests, the racism in policing. But then you also have to deal with, look at all the people that are in prison or in corrections right now. We have to engage in an aggressive form of decarceration for a large number of offenses that don't require separation from society. So if some kid goes in a joyride in a vehicle, that he or she does not pose a danger to himself or family such that you need to remove them and put them into solitary confinement and literally give them a life sentence, because that's what a record is. It's a life sentence. It means you won't get a job. You won't be able to provide for your family, and you're probably going to have to commit more acts of crime to be able to provide for yourself.
So then we have the recidivism.
Yeah, exactly. So we need to stop that. We need to really decarcerate, especially women and children. I mean, the first thing Nelson Mandela did when he was out of prison and became in power in Africa was release all women in prison, all African women in prison who had kids under 12. Why? Because the best life chance for that woman is to be with her kids, and the best life chance for those kids is to be with their mama. Because we know statistically, if mom or dad go to prison, the kids are far more likely to go to prison. So in all the ways where there's pipelines feeding this, we have to stop it. And the government has to stop blatant racial discrimination, start funding health care and education and housing at normal levels, and really address our historic dispossession.
Well, and this is their own report, so I mean, I guess we'll see what they do with this. Thank you so much for discussing it with me.
Thank you.
I always value your opinion on matters. Thanks.
Thanks.
Time for another quick break, but stick around. We're going to dive deep into the debate on whether the city of Montreal should be referred to as Mohawk territory. Here's the rest of Wednesday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta, 21 in Fort Chipewyan and Fort McMurray, cloudy and 18 for Red Deer and Calgary. Things warm up in British Columbia, 27 in Kamloops, Penticton and Campbell River, 24 for Prince Rupert and Smithers, 1 degree warmer in Fort Nelson. In the Yukon, 22 in Mayo and Whitehorse. Over to NWT, sunny skies, and 25 in Fort Simpson, 23 in Trout Lake and Wrigley. Rain and a high of just 4 above for Sax Harbor, 23 in Fort McPherson. In Nunavut, 15 in Baker Lake, 16 in Arviette, 17 for Chesterfield, plus 8 on Wednesday in Cape Dorset and Igloolik, plus 2 in Resolute. Welcome back. In this era of land acknowledgements, many have been calling Montreal unceded Mohawk territory. But some say that traditionally it's just not true. Tom Fenario has the story.
Montreal, an island in the middle of the St. Lawrence River, Canada's second largest city, and a traditional meeting place for many First Nations. To the Mohawk, it's known as Jojage, which translates as broken in two.
This is Mohawk territory. We're absolutely sure of it.
Broken in two is an apt metaphor for the ongoing debate as to whether Montreal should be acknowledged as Mohawk territory. During the city's last 2 birthday celebrations, it was acknowledged as such, which led to a backlash from members of Montreal's Historical Society. In this May letter to the Le Devoir paper, Professor Luc Normand-Tellier says calling Montreal Mohawk territory is a fake history. His letter points to a hypothesis that when Jacques Cartier first traveled to what is known as Montreal, he met a large settlement of First Nations known as the St. Lawrence Iroquois, and that due to linguistic and archaeological evidence, the St. Lawrence Iroquois are a distinct people from the Mohawk. When asked to be interviewed by APTN News, Tellier declined.
He doesn't understand oral tradition. He doesn't understand the scientific things we are finding. He's not understanding what is being found and how those findings show the presence of Iroquoian people in this whole area.
Before she became a council chief, Christine Zachary-Diome studied anthropology and worked at the Canadian Museum of History. She takes issue with several arguments that say the St. Lawrence Iroquois were distinct. Zachary-Diome points to linguists who say the Iroquoian words transcribed by Jacques Cartier were not accurate.
In our response, we mentioned about how the transcription by Jacques Cartier, it's an error rate of 50%.
Zachary-Diome says that Mohawk pottery bears a striking resemblance to those found in St. Lawrence Iroquois archaeological digs.
There's certain kinds of designs that are definitely Mohawk.
A very good example of the kind of pottery that we're finding on this site.
Archaeologist Christian Gates St. Pierre spent much of his career studying the various branches of Iroquoian peoples. This dig he is currently on is a longhouse from the 13th century, located about an hour and a half west of Montreal. He suspects that the artifacts being found here are St. Lawrence Iroquoian, although the time period is early. He says archaeological evidence points to the St. Lawrence Iroquois being a distinct but distant cousin of the Mohawk.
Regarding the similarities in terms of ceramics, yes, there are some similarities, but there are differences as well. Some people from the Mohawk community do put the accent on what is similar. I do put the accent on what is dissimilar, so those are just two different perspectives.
Further complicating matters is that 70 years after Cartier, Samuel de Champlain found that St. Lawrence Iroquois were nowhere to be found. Evidence suggests that in the 16th century, many of the St. Lawrence Iroquois were absorbed by the Mohawk.
I think that if we acknowledge that those groups that occupied the valley ended up moving out and amalgamating with other groups, I think that that helps to resolve some of the tension about who these people were and how they relate to different contemporary communities.
Both Gates St. Pierre and Birch say that while they consider the St. Lawrence Iroquois distinct from the Mohawk, they're willing to engage with other viewpoints.
I think that in the West, we're very preoccupied with almost sort of Victorian era notions of kinship rules and having sort of rights to names and places. And I think that Indigenous concepts of identity and lineage and ancestry don't necessarily map onto that very well.
For her part, Zachary-Diome hopes to one day prove the oral history taught to her by her great-uncle to the anthropologists of the world. She thinks the answer may lie just south of Montreal, on Kahnawake, Mohawk territory.
Nobody else does archaeological investigation along our riverside, and we need to do that, because this is going to be something we're going to be able to prove. And we're going to form an alliance with top archaeologists, and we're going to push forward our hypothesis.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Montreal.
Quite an interesting history lesson there. That's your APTN National News for this Tuesday. For more news anytime, visit our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. We'll see you back here tomorrow.